On the morning of April 27, 1945, at an altitude of roughly 6,200 feet above sea level, in a narrow valley where the Austrian Alps fold into themselves like the pages of a forbidden book, a convoy of 11 trucks painted in fading Wehrmacht grey began its final climb into the mountains. The air was thin and cold, sharp enough to make breath visible, and the engine noise echoed off the granite walls. On either side of the road with a mechanical persistence that seemed almost defiant. Spring had not yet reached this elevation. Snow still clung to the shadowed slopes, streaked with black where rocks broke through, and the few trees that grew at this height stood twisted and stunted, survivors of winters that could kill a man in hours. The lead truck carried 22 men of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, most of them younger than 25. Their faces wind-burned and hollow from weeks of retreat. Behind them, the remaining 10 vehicles carried something else entirely, something that would never be accounted for, something that would transform this forgotten moment into one of the war's most enduring mysteries. The driver of the lead vehicle, a corporal named Franz Huber from a village outside Salzburg, had been awake for 31 hours. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, but his mind moved through that dangerous territory between alertness and hallucination that comes from prolonged exhaustion. He watched the road with the kind of focus that erases everything else: the stone, the ice, the drop. To his right, the valley opened into a vertica, a fall of more than 800 feet, a chasm that swallowed light and gave back only silence. He did not look at it. Men who looked too long at drops like that sometimes drove into them. The truck behind him followed at a distance of roughly 40 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough to avoid disaster if the lead vehicle lost traction. This was a column that understood survival. They had been moving since the collapse of the Gothic Line, since the fall of Vienna, since the moment when the entire Eastern Front stopped being a front and became simply a direction. West, always west, away from the Soviets, toward the Americans, toward something that felt less like annihilation. But what Huber and the others did not fully understand, what could not have been clear to them in the fog of collapse and desperation, was that this convoy had already ceased to exist in any official sense. No Wehrmacht log recorded its departure. No divisional headquarters expected its arrival. The trucks themselves had been requisitioned from a motor pool that was itself in the process of being overrun, and the cargo they carried had no manifest. To no inventory, no paperwork of any kind. Later, when the questions began, when Allied intelligence officers started piecing together fragments of testimony and intercepted radio traffic, they would find only gaps. A convoy that moved through history like a ghost, present enough to be remembered, absent enough to be doubted, and the men inside it, those young soldiers with their hollow faces and their fading faith in orders, had become the custodians of something they could not name and would not survive to explain. The column had left its last known position 3 days earlier, departing from a commandeered farm complex near Bad Ischl in the early hours before dawn. Witnesses later recalled the sound of engines starting in the darkness, the glow of headlights briefly illuminating the farmhouse walls before the convoy turned onto the mountain road and disappeared into the pre-dawn fog. An elderly woman who lived near the farm, interviewed in 1950, by a researcher compiling oral histories of the war's final weeks, remembered seeing the trucks pass. She said they moved slowly, heavily, as if weighted down by something more than men. She said the soldiers did not speak. She said there was a quality to the silence that felt wrong, deliberate, like the quiet that follows a crime. Her testimony, dismissed at the time as the exaggeration of memory, would later acquire a different weight when their pieces of the story began to surface. What was in those trucks? The question has generated 6 decades of speculation, investigation, conspiracy, and myth. Some have claimed it was gold, looted from the Reichsbank and destined for rat lines that would carry high-ranking SS officers into South America. Others have insisted it was art, masterpieces stolen from museums across occupied Europe, crated and hidden for a Fourth Reich that would never come. Still others have spoken of share files containing evidence of war crimes so extensive that their destruction became a final mission, more important than survival itself. And then there are the darker theories, the ones that speak of experimental materials, weapons prototypes, medical research conducted in places where ethics had long since been murdered. The truth is that no one knows, not definitively, not with certainty. What is known is this: the convoy was heavy, slow, and desperate, and it vanished. By the afternoon of April 27th, the column had reached a section of the mountain road that local guides, had there been any available, would have advised against. The path narrowed to barely 12 feet across, carved into the side of a slope so steep that a stone dropped from the edge would fall for 7 seconds before hitting bottom. On the left side, the mountain rose almost vertically, sheets of rock broken by ice and the skeletal, remains of trees that had lost their grip on the earth decades before. On the right side, nothing, just air and gravity and the white noise of a stream so far below that its sound reached the road as a kind of background hum, constant and meaningless. Huber downshifted, feeling the engine strain, feeling the weight behind him. The truck groaned. The brakes, already worn from the descent earlier that morning, gave off a smell like burning hair. He kept his eyes forward. Behind him, the convoy compressed slightly, each driver instinctively closing the gap, seeking the psychological comfort of proximity, even as tactical doctrine demanded spacing. It was here at approximately 1400 hours that the first truck stopped. No one recorded why. Mechanical failure, perhaps. A blown tire. Engine trouble. Or maybe something simpler and more human. A driver who looked at the road ahead, at the narrowness and the ice and the drop, and decided he could go no further. The convoy behind him halted in sequence, each vehicle grinding to a stop, each driver cutting the engine to save fuel, and, in the sudden silence, the wind became audible, a low moan that moved through the valley like the breath of something vast and indifferent. The men climbed out. They stood in the road, stamping their feet, breathing into their hands, looking at the mountains around them with the expressions of soldiers who had begun to understand that the war would not end with surrender. It would end with cold, with altitude, with the simple physics of distance, and exhaustion. What happened next remains unclear, a gap in the record that has never been satisfactorily explained. Some accounts suggest that the convoy continued after a brief delay, that the mechanical issue was resolved and the trucks moved on. Other accounts, based on testimony gathered years later from local villagers and recovered partisan intelligence reports, suggest that the convoy split, that some vehicles turned back, descending into the valley and scattering, while others pushed forward, higher into the mountains, following a route that existed on no map. A farmer named Johann Kreutz, living at that time in a hamlet called Hintersee, later told investigators that he saw trucks passing through the forest above his property on the evening of April 27th. He said they were moving without lights. He said he counted 8 of them, though the darkness made certainty impossible. He said the sound of their engines was muffled, as if they were trying to be quiet, and that the attempt itself was more frightening than if they had simply roared past. He did not approach them. He locked his doors and waited for morning. By April 28th, the war in Europe had less than 10 days remaining. In Berlin, Soviet forces were closing in on the Führer bunker, grinding through the ruins block by block, and the sound of artillery was constant, an industrial thunder that shook plaster from the ceiling and rattled the teeth of anyone still alive underground. In Italy, the German forces were collapsing, entire divisions surrendering en masse to Allied troops who had pushed through the Po Valley and were now racing north toward the Alps. And in the mountains themselves, in those high valleys where snow still covered the ground and the only law was survival, scattered groups of SS soldiers, Wehrmacht stragglers, and deserters moved through the wilderness like fragments of a broken army, seeking refuge, seeking escape, seeking anything that was not death. The convoy, wherever it was, had become part of this dissolution. It had ceased to be a military unit and had become instead a fragment of the war's ending, a piece of history too small to matter and too strange to forget. The last confirmed sighting came on April 29th. A pair of American reconnaissance pilots, flying a routine patrol over the Alps in a Piper L4 observation plane, reported seeing vehicle tracks in the snow at an altitude of approximately 7,000 feet, near a pass that connected 2 valleys in a region that was, at the time, controlled by neither the Allies nor the Germans, but simply by the mountains themselves. The tracks led up hard into terrain that should have been impassable for wheeled vehicles, and then disappeared into a section of forest so dense that the canopy obscured everything beneath it. The pilots circled twice, noting the location in their logbook, and then returned to base. The sighting was filed in a report that no one read with any urgency. There were more immediate concerns. The war was ending. The paperwork could wait. It never stopped waiting. In the weeks and months that followed Germany's surrender, as Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Europe to catalogue the wreckage of the Reich, the story of the convoy began to emerge in pieces. A decoded radio intercept mentioned a transport moving west from Bad Ischl on April 24th. A captured SS officer, interrogated at a detention facility in Munich, mentioned hearing rumors of a special convoy tasked with moving sensitive materials into the mountains for safekeeping. A local Austrian police report, filed in May of 1945, noted the discovery of abandoned Wehrmacht trucks near a village called St. Wolfgang, their cargo bays empty, their engines cold. None of these pieces connected, not immediately, not in a way that suggested urgency. But over time, as the occupation settled into routine and the initial chaos of victory gave WWII to the longer, slower work of justice and memory, certain investigators began to notice patterns, gaps in the record, silences that felt deliberate, and at the center of it all, this convoy, this column that vanished. The first organized search took place in the summer of 1946, led by a combined team of American and British investigators tasked with tracking down looted assets and war criminals. They focused on the area around Bad Ischl and the mountain passes to the west, interviewing locals, examining vehicle tracks, searching abandoned buildings and caves. They found nothing, or rather, they found pieces of nothing. A burned-out truck chassis near the Dachstein Massif, its identification plates removed. A cache of empty fuel drums hidden in a shepherd's hut at 8,000 feet, marked with Wehrmacht stencils, but providing no clue as to who had left them or when. A set of tire tracks, photographed in June before the snow melted entirely, that led into a ravine and then simply stopped, as if the vehicle had driven off the edge of the earth. The investigators filed their reports. Note the inconclusive findings, and moved on to other cases. The convoy became a footnote, a mystery without stakes. The war had left so many unanswered questions that one more hardly mattered. But for some, it did matter. In the decades that followed, the story of the lost convoy acquired a life of its own, migrating from classified intelligence files into the realm of myth and speculation. Books were written, documentaries were made. Treasure hunters arrived in the Alps with maps and metal detectors, convinced that somewhere in those mountains lay a cache of gold or art or secrets valuable enough to justify the search. Most found nothing. A few found fragments, corroded engine parts, scraps of uniform, shell casings from weapons that had not been fired. One team, working in 1973 near the Hallstätter Sea, discovered what appeared to be a concealed cave entrance at approximately 7,200 feet, sealed with rocks and debris in a way that suggested human intervention. Inside, they found the remains of 2 trucks, both burned almost beyond recognition, and the skeletal remains of 3 men, their identities impossible to determine after nearly 3 decades of exposure to the elements. Tests on the vehicles confirmed they were of German manufacture, dated to the early 1940s, but no markings remained to connect them definitively to the convoy. The discovery made news briefly, then faded. The mountains keep their secrets well. What really happened on those roads in the final days of April 1945? The most likely scenario, stripped of romanticism and conspiracy, is both simpler and sadder than the myths suggest. The convoy, overloaded and under-maintained, probably broke down in the mountains. Faced with impassable terrain, dwindling fuel, and the knowledge that surrender was imminent, the soldiers likely scattered. Some may have destroyed the trucks to prevent their cargo, whatever it was, from falling into Allied hands. Others may have simply walked away, discarding uniforms and documents, melting into the civilian population that was itself in chaos. The cargo, if it was valuable, was probably looted by the soldiers themselves, or by local opportunists who stumbled upon the abandoned vehicles in the days and weeks after the surrender. Gold can be melted, art can be hidden, documents can be burned, and the men who knew the truth took it with them, into anonymity or death, leaving behind only the shape of a story, the outline of something that almost was. But there is another possibility, darker and less easily dismissed. In the final weeks of the war, as the Nazi state collapsed, certain elements within the SS and the Wehrmacht undertook what can only be described as scorched earth operations against history itself. Archives were burned, witnesses were eliminated, evidence of atrocities was buried or destroyed. It is possible, perhaps even probable, that the convoy was part of this effort, that I, Test cargo was not treasure but testimony, files documenting medical experiments conducted in the camps, records of executions and mass graves, evidence that could have been used in war crimes trials. If this was the case, then the convoy's disappearance was not an accident but a success, a final act of erasure, and the men who drove those trucks into the mountains were not soldiers fleeing defeat, but custodians of silence, ensuring that certain stories would never be told. The mountains themselves offer no answers. They rise now as they did then, indifferent to the histories that play out in their valleys and on their slopes. Snow falls each winter, covering the old roads, filling in the tracks, smoothing over the scars. Trees grow where trucks once passed, streams erode the stone, and somewhere, in a place that may never be found, the remnants of the convoy rest. Rusted metal, scattered bones, fragments of a moment. To when the entire world was ending, and a small group of men burdened with secrets or plunder, or simply the weight of their own fear, drove into the wilderness and did not return. In the years since, the story has been told and retold, each version shaped by the needs and obsessions of the teller. For some, it is a treasure hunt, a promise of gold hidden in the Alps, waiting for the lucky or the persistent. For others, it is a parable about the banality of evil, about ordinary men tasked with extraordinary crimes who vanished into the landscape as if they had never been. And for a few, it remains what it always was, a quest. Sion without an answer, a gap in the historical record that represents all the other gaps, all the other silences, all the other moments when the machinery of atrocity and the chaos of collapse met and produced only absence. What is certain is this: 11 trucks left Bad Ischl in late April of 1945. They carried men, and they carried something else. They climbed into the Alps at a time when the mountains were more remote and unforgiving than they are today, when a wrong turn could mean death, and when the collapse of all authority meant that no one was looking for you, and no one was coming to help. And somewhere along that route, in a valley or a pass, or a forest whose name may never be known, they stopped. The engines went silent. The men stepped out into the cold, and whatever happened next left no trace except the story itself, passed down through testimony and rumor, and the strange persistence of unanswered questions. The last man who could have known the truth, an SS officer named Heinz Kessler, who served with the 6th Mountain Division and was captured by American forces in early May of 1945, was interviewed repeatedly over the years by researchers and journalists. He always gave the same answer. He said he knew of the convoy. He said he had heard rumors. He said that in those final days, orders came from sources that no longer existed, directing men to destinations that were not on any map, and that the chaos was so complete that even those giving the orders often did not know what they were ordering or why. When pressed, when asked directly if he knew what the convoy carried or where it went, he would pause, he would look away, and then he would say in a voice that carried neither pride nor shame, but only a kind of exhausted certainty, that some questions are not meant to be answered. Read that the war left wounds too deep to heal and graves too numerous to mark, and that the convoy was just one more among thousands of stories that ended in silence. He died in 1998 at the age of 81, in a nursing home outside Stuttgart. His obituary made no mention of the convoy. His family, when contacted by a historian researching the topic, declined to comment. And the mountains, ancient and patient, continue to hold whatever remains, buried under decades of snow and soil and the slow accumulation of forgetting. The convoy that vanished in the Alps is not just a story about treasure or secrets or the end of a war. It is a story about absence itself, about the things we lose not because they are taken, but because they are released, let go, allowed to drift into the space between memory and myth, where nothing can be proven and nothing can be denied. It is a story that reminds us that history is not a complete record, but a collection of fragments, and that some of those fragments are shaped not by what they contain, but by WWII. Third Reich, the empty space, the missing truck, the silence at the end of the road. And so the convoy remains, neither fully lost nor fully found, suspended in that strange territory between fact and legend where the most enduring stories live. Somewhere in the Austrian Alps, beneath the snow and the stone and the centuries of indifference, 11 trucks may still rest. Their cargo may still be there, whatever it was, waiting, or perhaps there is nothing there at all. Perhaps the convoy destroyed itself, burned its secrets, scat, teared its bones and left behind only the idea of a mystery, which is sometimes more powerful than any truth. In the end, what matters is not what was lost, but what the loss represents. The final days of a regime that believed it could rewrite reality through force. The desperate flight of men who understood too late that they had served something monstrous. And the mountains themselves, silent witnesses to a moment when the machinery of history broke down and left behind only questions that echo unanswered through the decades. The column that vanished in the Alps is still vanishing, still moving through the fog of history, still carrying its secrets into higher and more remote places where the air is thin and the silence is absolute, and the only certainty is that some stories end not with revelation, but with the slow, cold acceptance that we will never know. The trucks are gone, the men are gone. Only the mountains remain, indifferent and eternal, keeping faith with the dead. The search has never truly stopped. Even now, more than 80 years after those trucks disappeared into the high passes, teams continue to comb the Austrian Alps with tools that would have seemed like magic to Franz Huber and his exhausted convoy. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, drones equipped with thermal sensors that can detect the faint heat signatures of metal buried beneath layers of earth and ice. In the summer of 2000, DN19, a research team from the University of Innsbruck conducted a systematic survey of the region between Bad Ischl and the Dachstein Massif, focusing on areas identified in declassified intelligence reports as possible routes for the convoy. They spent 11 weeks in the mountains, working at altitudes that required acclimatization and constant monitoring for signs of altitude sickness. They found anomalies, magnetic signatures, stent with large metal objects buried at depths ranging from 6 to 15 feet, irregular depressions in the terrain that suggested collapsed structures or filled-in vehicle tracks. But when they excavated two of the most promising sites, they found nothing but geological formations, mineral deposits that happened to have the same electromagnetic profile as buried steel. The lead researcher, a geophysicist named Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann, later described the experience in an interview published in an academic journal focused on conflict archaeology. She spoke about the particular frustration of working in an environment where nature itself conspires to hide the past. The freeze-thaw cycles that crack metal and scatter debris across hundreds of yards. The rock slides that can bury an entire valley floor under 30 feet of stone in a single afternoon. The streams that shift their courses, eroding evidence, carrying fragments downstream until they are unrecognizable. She said that searching for the convoy was like trying to find a specific snowflake in an avalanche that happened decades ago. The metaphor was apt, but she also said something else, something that revealed the deeper hold this mystery has on those who pursue it. She said that every time they detected an anomaly, every time the instrument suggested something man-made beneath the earth, she felt a surge of something that was not quite hope and not quite dread, but some emotion that combined both. The possibility of finding the convoy was inseparable from the question of what finding it would mean, because the truth is that not everyone wants the convoy found. In the years since the war ended, as the full scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable, as the testimonies of survivors accumulated and the documentation of systematic murder reached into the millions of pages, the idea that somewhere in the Alps there might be additional evidence, more files, more proof, has taken on a quality that is almost supernatural. For Holocaust historians, for prosecutors at the various war crimes trials that continued into the 21st century, for the families of victims who never received justice, the convoy represents a possibility that is both precious and terrible. Precious because evidence matters, because documentation can force recognition where testimony is doubted. Terrible because the finding of such evidence would also be a confirmation that the machinery of erasure was real, that, in those final weeks, the Nazi state devoted resources and men to the destruction of its own historical record, and that the absence we feel when we try to trace certain crimes might not be the result of chaos, but of intention. Others have different reasons for hoping the convoy stays lost. In the villages around Bad Ischl and St. Wolfgang, among families who have lived in those valleys for generations, there are stories that are not told to outsiders. Stories about grandparents who suddenly had gold coins in the years after the war, about cellars that were cleared out in the middle of the night, about men who left their farms in the spring of 1945 and returned weeks later with haunted expressions and instructions never to speak about where they had been. These stories exist in the realm of family whisper, passed down with the understanding that they represent a kind of inherited guilt, a complicity that might have been necessary for survival or might have been simple opportunism, but which in either case is not something to be examined too closely. If the convoy is found, if its contents are catalogued and traced, there is a possibility that some of these family secrets will be exposed, that the gold or the art or the documents might carry traces back to those who took them. And so there is, in certain quarters, a quiet but unmistakable preference for the mystery to remain exactly that. The mythology around the convoy has also attracted a darker element. Neo-Nazi groups and far-right organizations have over the decades seized upon the story as evidence of a secret continuity, a hidden reserve of resources and documentation that supposedly proves the Reich was preparing for resurrection. Online forums dedicated to revisionist history and Holocaust denial speak of the convoy as if it were a holy grail, a cache of true records that will somehow vindicate the indefensible. These groups have organized their own searches, poorly funded expeditions that typically accomplish nothing beyond trespassing and the occasional arrest for illegal excavation. But their interest has had a chilling effect on legitimate research. Several academic teams have faced harassment and threats for their work on the convoy. Archaeological sites have been vandalized. In 2011, a memorial near Hallstatt that commemorated victims of Nazi slave labor was defaced with graffiti that referenced the convoy and suggested its discovery would reveal the lies. The vandals were never identified. This contamination of the story, this weaponization of mystery by those who would use it to spread poison, represents perhaps the convoy's most insidious legacy. It has transformed a historical question into an ideological battleground, making serious research more difficult and ensuring that any findings will be immediately politicized. Dr. Hartmann, the geophysicist who led the 2019 survey, noted this in her interview. She added that her team received death threats before the expedition even began, messages accusing them of trying to suppress evidence or hide the truth. The threats were specific enough that they required police investigation. She said the experience made her understand viscerally why some mysteries might be better left unsolved, not because the truth is dangerous, but because the search for truth has been so thoroughly corrupted by those who have no interest in truth at all. And yet the search continues, driven now not just by academic curiosity or the hope of closure, but by something more fundamental, a refusal to let silence have the final word. In 2022, a coalition of European historical institutions launched a new initiative called the Alpine Memory Project, dedicated to documenting and preserving evidence of World War II activity in the mountain regions of Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy. The project employs advanced archaeological techniques, oral history collection, and archival research to create a comprehensive database of sites, events, and testimonies. The Lost Convoy is one of dozens of cases they are investigating, but it has become in some ways emblematic of the project's larger mission. The project director, an Austrian historian named Thomas Brenner, explained it this way in a press conference announcing the initiative. "We are not treasure hunters. We are not solving mysteries for the sake of drama. We are trying to complete the historical record to fill in the absences so that future generations have access to something closer to truth. Every silence in the record represents a victory for those who wanted history erased. Every piece of evidence we recover, no matter how small, is an act of resistance against that erasure." The convoy in this framing becomes more than just a story about missing trucks and unknown cargo. It becomes a symbol of the larger struggle between memory and forgetting, between the impulse to document and the impulse to hide. And in that struggle, the stakes are never purely historical. They are moral, ethical, existential, because what we choose to remember and what we allow to be forgotten shapes who we are as a civilization. The convoy war vanished in April of 1945, but its absence has been working on us ever since. A gap in the record that generates speculation, obsession, and a persistent feeling that something important was lost before we even knew it was there. In the village of Hintersee, where the farmer Johann Kreutz claimed to have seen trucks moving through the forest without lights, there is now a small museum dedicated to the region's experience during the war. It occupies 3 rooms on the ground floor of what was once a schoolhouse. The exhibits are modest: photographs, documents, artifacts recovered from the surrounding mountains, helmets, canteens, shell casings, the usual detritus of retreat, and collapse. But in one corner of the third room, there is a display dedicated specifically to the convoy. It consists of a map showing the possible routes, a timeline of sightings, and a collection of testimonies from locals who claimed encounters with the trucks or their crews. The display is careful, avoiding sensationalism, presenting the information without drawing conclusions, and at the center of the display, mounted on the wall in a PL frame, is a photograph. The photograph was taken in 1947 by an American army photographer who was documenting displaced persons camps and refugee movements in the Austrian countryside. It shows a section of mountain road, rutted and damaged, with snow still visible on the higher slopes in the background, and in the foreground, partially visible beneath overgrown vegetation, is what appears to be the rusted remains of a truck chassis. The photograph is GR. Only the details difficult to make out, but the shape is unmistakable. The caption beneath the frame reads, "Unidentified vehicle wreckage, approximately 12 kilometers west of Bad Ischl, photographed May 1947. Possible connection to lost convoy, location now unknown." That last phrase is crucial. The site where the photograph was taken cannot be located with certainty. The road has been rebuilt multiple times since the 1940s. The landscape has changed. The vegetation has grown. And so even this tangible piece of evidence, this photograph of something real, has become another absence, another piece of the mystery rather than a solution to it. The museum curator, a woman in her 60s named Greta Moser, whose grandfather fought on the Russian front and whose grandmother survived the occupation by bartering eggs for safety, sometimes gives talks to school groups who visit the exhibit. She tells them about the convoy, about the different theories and the searches and the unanswered questions, and then she asks them why they think the story matters. The students offer various answers. So, me say it's about the treasure, about the possibility of gold or art. Others say it's about justice, about holding people accountable for crimes. A few, the more thoughtful ones, say it's about knowing what happened, about not letting important pieces of history disappear. Moser listens to all of these answers, nodding, acknowledging them, and then she tells them what she thinks. She says the story matters because it reminds us that history is no finished thing, that the past is not safely contained in textbooks and museums, that there are still gaps, still silences, still questions that we have not answered and may never answer, and that living with those questions, holding them without needing to resolve them immediately, is part of what it means to think historically, to understand that the past is vast and complex, and that our knowledge of it is always partial, always incomplete. This is perhaps the convoy's truest legacy, not the possibility of treasure or evidence or resolution, but the question itself, the reminder that there are things we do not know, that history is full of shadows and blank spaces, and that those shadows and blank spaces are not failures of scholarship, but inherent features of the past. The convoy vanished, yes, but in vanishing, it left behind something that might be more valuable than whatever it carried. It left behind a question that forces us to confront the limits of knowledge, the persistence of mystery, and the uncomfortable truth that some stories do not have endings. They simply stop, and we are left to make sense of the stopping. Franz Huber, the driver of the lead truck, was never conclusively identified among the prisoners taken by Allied forces in the weeks after Germany's surrender. His name appears on no camp rosters, no interrogation records, no lists of the dead. If he survived, he did so by disappearing into the chaos of post-war Europe, by discarding his uniform and his identity, and becoming one of the millions of displaced persons who filled the roads and camps and temporary shelters in those first terrible months of peace. If he died, his body lies somewhere unmarked, another casualty of a war that killed so many that individual deaths lost all meaning. The young corporal who had been awake for 31 hours, whose hands were steady on the wheel as he guided his truck up into the mountains, whose mind moved through that dangerous territory between alertness and hallucination, is now part of the silent, tiny part of the convoy's cargo, part of what was lost. But in that loss, there is a strange kind of presence. The convoy exists now more vividly than it did in those final days of April 1945. It exists in the imagination of everyone who has heard the story. It exists in the documentaries and the books and the late-night conversations between history enthusiasts who argue about what might have happened. It exists in the mountains themselves, which hold the secret, or hold nothing at all. It makes no difference. The idea of the convoy has become more real than any cache of gold or art could ever be. It has become a story that we tell about the war, about mystery, about the impossibility of ever truly knowing the past. And stories, once they reach a certain point, cannot be killed by facts. They live on their own terms, sustained not by evidence, but by need. The need to wonder, the need to search, the need to believe that somewhere, out there, buried or hidden or simply waiting, is an answer that will make sense of the chaos. And so the convoy continues its journey, not through the Alps, not anymore, but through time, moving forward into the future, always just ahead of us, always just beyond reach. The trucks climb higher, the air grows thinner, the road narrows to nothing, and we follow, knowing we will never catch up, knowing the journey is all there is, knowing that the column that vanished in the Alps has become eternal precisely because it vanished. Complete. Disappeared. Perfect in its absence. A story without an ending, which is the most enduring kind of story there is. The mountains do not care. They rise in their ancient silence, wearing the snow, shedding the snow, indifferent to the dramas that play out on their slopes. A convoy came through, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it scattered. Maybe it burned. Maybe it drove off the edge and fell and is still falling, suspended in the infinite moment between departure and arrival. And the men who were there, who knew what happened, who saw what was in those trucks and understood what it meant, are gone. Dust and memory and the slowly fading records of a catastrophe too large to be fully documented. All we have left is the story, the gap, the silence, and the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains, or nowhere at all, the answer waits. Patient, permanent, unknowable as stone.